Hi, I'm Seamless, and today is Wednesday, which is the time for the next sound design request tutorial. That's the sound. And what I was trying to do was recreate Far Too Loud's sort of vocoder sort of sound in his track 600 Years. Now, there was a lot of sounds going on in that song. It had FM patches, Reese's everywhere, and the vocode stuff, and it was all very well and good. And this is one I think I have more success with than I did the Kill the Noise sound. And though the differences still remain, and the differences are largely in the processing. What do I mean by processing? Because what's processing other than what I'm doing here? I suppose actually what I mean is post-processing, because the process here, I got right. I have a carrier, a modulator, and a vocoding, and I'm vocoding it, and it makes the same sound. I'm even distorting it using guitar type distortion, which is something that Far Too Loud likes doing, and it's creating a nifty sound. So that's kind of the basic idea of it. And then getting it to the level that he ended up having it has a lot to do with EQing, compression, multiband distortion, sort of stuff that I don't really have a clue, as to his direction kind of thing. I have some clues. In fact, I have a pretty big clue. The biggest clue is the fact that he actually made a video where he talked about how his sort of bass design philosophy as it was applied in the track 600 Years. There's a video of him talking about this. I don't remember what the video was called or the magazine that did it. I think it was a magazine. Basically, if you just search Far Too Loud 600 Years bass, you'll see it. And give me a second as I whack my amp. First try. Okay. So what's happening in this sound here? Couple of new things for me anyway happened when making this sound. One of the new things is the fact that the carrier isn't itself being modulated, in the sense that I used FM to make the sound, but I'm not modulating the FM. Normally when I make a FM a vocoder bass, my favorite carrier to start with is an FM sort of growl bass, and then I modulate that underneath the modulation added on by some kind of vocal. In this case, it's actually my voice that got pitch corrected to the tonic of the song, which is F. And that's what I decided to do. And it worked out pretty okay. And let's look in the mixer here. You have quite the spread going on. I probably could have achieved a lot of this using a patcher channel, but I was not thinking about that when I made this track. This sound. It's not a track. I suppose technically it's a track, but it's not really. So I've labeled these here just to make this a little bit more cut and dry for you, because it's not super duper obvious. So in this channel with nothing going on, I have the dry carrier sound, which I will show you what it sounds like now. And this is being routed to another channel for some reason. That's the carrier sound. Now what's happening here? There's also some kind of nice weird little Reese modulation, and that's actually a neat little touch I added kind of by accident that I thought ended up being cool. So what I have here is I have a fundamental tone being FM'd by a weird little oscillator window, and I'll explain what's going on here in a second. But let's look at it over here. The fundamental tone that I'm FMing is actually set to 0.24, which is not an even tone. I mean, it's even numbers, but it's not the root note. The root note is 0.25, which I have this guy set to. This is the one. But notice how when I move that note around, it still sounds like it's the fundamental tone. It still has the right period length, at least to our ears, that it's the right note. And that's because this guy is modulating it. Now, this is interesting. What the shape I decided to use here was born of some research that I basically learned by watching that Far Too Loud video. I learned some things about FM that I had not previously considered, and I will in fact talk about this in the next How to Bass. So be ready for that. Be ready for that. Be ready. Hunting wascally FM modulation. That was weird. Anywho, what ends up happening here is that there's no fundamental tone in this sound, but because of the way that this is being distributed, and this is just here for fun, for high frequency jazz, the waveform is still the right length, right? So then I have some phasing. The way the oscillator window works is that you have harmonic level up here, and then underneath here we have harmonic phase. which as you see has a pretty big impact on the sound. But what's creating that wobble? Why is that happening? Well, that's because this is at 0.25 and this is at 0.23. So and I actually changed that while it was being modulated by the whole sound because I liked the sound of it being Did I change the pitch on accident? That's what it sounds when it's even. And this is what it sounds like when it's a bit off. It's because I screwed with the phase. That sounds weird. Anyway, messing around with that, as you see, creates very interesting and different sort of timbres in the sound. And screwing with this especially creates very different carrier behavior that translates very interestingly into the vocoder setup that we have. So now what's going on in the vocoder? So what I mean, if you're new to the idea of a vocoder, what is a vocoder? Well, a vocoder, in this example, I'm using Vocodex, it's a carrier modulator relationship. And I just showed you the carrier, which is the synth that we're using to create the sound. And then it's being modulated by a voice, which in this case is mine. And then while the voice is playing, I can actually show you this in here, I think. That's my voice. And as you see here, it's influencing the bands. Now, a vocoder breaks up the carrier sound into a whole bunch of bands. It basically band splits it. And then the level of those individual bands across the spectrum is determined by the EQ analysis the spectral analysis of the modulator. And that's how it applies. Certain vocoders do this differently, but by and large, most of the primary controls are the same. However, in my personal opinion, Vocodex does it the best, at least digitally. I think Vocodex is the best digital vocoder you can have. Lots of people, including people who are pretty well in the know, like to talk about people using hardware talk boxes. Talk boxes are not the same thing as vocoders. There are such things as hardware vocoders, but they are not. They work in this way, the way I described. But talk boxes are actually freaky. Like how they do their thing. Like look it up sometime. Like Wikipedia, how a talk box works. The hardware and mechanical process. But who came up with that? Like why would it have occurred to anyone to do it? Whatever. It's cool. It's awesome. And it arises a similar kind of sound, but with a very, very, very much different sort of timbre. And we are trying to mimic this sort of stuff because, it's widely known that Kill the Noise uses talkbox kind of stuff. I'd say widely known, but it's not necessarily sort of fact, at least not in my eyes. It's not something that I know is super duper fact. It's something that I know. I have a reasonable percentage of a chance of it being accurate, but don't take that as gospel. Because really, we don't have talkboxes. You can go and get one for like $179 and see if you like it, but Vocodex is good for now. But before we get there, though, I want to talk about some stuff I did with the carrier. So I talked about the carrier, and I also talked about the split that I have going on. In the split, it's going into the sub channel, which is just a high pass filter. So it's only being the low. And then we have carrier guitar over here. And this is basically the distortion processing that I'm using on the carrier. Now this, see, there's a way for me to show you what this sounds like. I can do basically what I did here. Now I showed you what the carrier sound like, basically completely dry, and this is what it sounds like as it being just processed by a wave shaper, which is just a very simple shape going on, and then also a guitar rig, which also has a very simple sort of stack happening. when I put up this FLP for you to use, I will include one that has this guitar rig set up, and I'll include one that does not have a guitar rig. Actually, no, I don't think that matters, because if you don't have it, it just won't open it. So then you'll be fine. So just replace guitar rig with some kind of guitar-related distortion. You could probably, if you have FM8, you could load up the effects suite and then load up just an overdrive and a cab, and you can more or less mimic this, especially because this is a guitar rig, and I'm pretty sure FM8 has a lot of the same cabinet emulation as being used in guitar rig, so you're pretty okay in that regard. Other things you can do include looking up third-party distortion modules, even using ImageLine's own hardcore. If you disable the cabinet emulation, it's a pretty decent guitar distortion plugin, and then but you still need cabinet emulation. So the whole point of the way that guitar digital emulation works is that you have amplifier simulation and cabinet simulation, emulation. And there's a difference between those two words, but I'm not really sure what they are. Distortion is pretty easy to come by, but cabinet simulation is really what makes the tone of a guitar. That sound that we hear and that we associate with being a guitar sound is completely the result of the coloring that's present in speaker cones, speaker cabinets, and guitar cabinets. Speaker cabinets. And the easiest way, like the most direct way to emulate that would be to Google guitar impulse response. And you'll find cabinet impulse response files. And they work pretty much the same way as convolution reverb response files. In fact, you can put those cabinet IRs, the impulse response files, in the convolver and put this after the distortion chain, your guitar distortion chain, and it will have the exact same effect as having a cabinet simulation after the distortion. So that's what and there's plenty of free ones everywhere. There's free distortion everywhere. You can make your own distortion without any of these things. And you can just EQ it if you want to, but the point is that you want to arrive at a guitar-related distortion sound. That's if you're going to go for the far too loud thing. That's just what's up with that. So that's how I designed the carrier at this stage. And that's going into the vocoder. So then we have the vocoder. I've showed you the carrier and I've showed you the modulator. What's happening here? Well, on the surface, the pretty basic changes are I have a little bit of a bandwidth change happening. I'm on order 4, and this has particular property changes. I actually have a tutorial. It's how to base 26, I think. It's around that range. It's called How Vocodex Works. And I break down what every single thing in vocoder does and how it does it and why. And I'm not going to go super in depth with like the theory behind all this stuff, but if you want to know more, head on down to that video. So I have a playlist on my channel with all the how to base videos, and you can find it in there. Eventually, I'll probably do a basics tutorial about that just to sort of even up the series presence. Anywho, so bandwidth. Now, when you change bandwidth, I'm going to copy this value so I don't forget it. You get that if you get too low. And if you get too far up, it gets a little weird as well. Of course, this is something that you want to set to taste. You know, I prefer it to be where it is here. If I base the value, yeah. Now, over here, we have filter fatness. And what this does is it kind of attenuates that glassy effect that you get, especially when you're in order 4. This is very pronounced settings for vocoding in this regard. If I had this all the way on and I made lower bandwidth settings, I actually have to get pretty far before that glass sound comes in. But if I have it off, you can see that I can have much higher bandwidth settings and even thicker than the gaps in between the bands, and the sharpness will still kind of remain. And so that's what this sort of thing does. Paste value. Over here we have the bandwidth multiplier, which is not by default at the center, and more over here it's kind of more saturated and smooth. Like you can see that the band curving on the top is very smooth. If I go all the way down, it's very sharp and full of crevices and valleys and stuff like that. So this is only a little smoother. And this is the main pitch of the modulator. Now, because of the way that the modulator is being interpreted, when we talk about pitch, we're not actually changing the input pitch of the modulator sound. The modulator itself, the audio that's going into the vocoder, is not changing. What this is, though, is this changing how the analysis is being applied to the sound. As we talked about earlier, the bands are the result of a spectral analysis of the incoming modulator, and it creates the levels of individual bands as a position on the spectrum. And if you change the pitch of the modulator in this thing here, in modulator pitch shift, what this basically does is it moves the analysis result up or down. And so this means basically the filtering as a result of the modulator is in a higher position or a lower position in the spectrum. Which is, again, something that you want to set to your own personal tastes. I have unison now, but I'm not using it, so I'm going to turn it off. We have how many bands there are by default. There's 47. You can have anywhere between 100 and 5. So I decided on 45 because I dicked around and that sounded pretty good. We have attack, release, and hold, and what this does is this determines the behavior of a band when it's triggered by the modulator's movement. And so we have hold, as in when it's triggered, how long it gets to whatever level it is and it stays there, and then release is how long it takes for it to fall. Now the thing is, though, is that there's also an attack thing here, and this is how long it takes the band to go to a position once it's triggered by the modulator. And when that's all the way off and there's any kind of release, you can hear, like if I turn it up really high, you can kind of hear it if the fall off lasts longer, but the triggering still comes back immediately. The movement of the modulator is still known. You can still hear it moving at the same speed. Because when the modulator moves around and it triggers new band position, the band positioning goes back up, but it just takes a longer time for the band to fall back down. So that's what that kind of thing is, and keep that in mind when you're messing around with it. And then we have a whole bunch of drop-down menus for most of these things. So we can alter things like the bandwidth per position in the spectrum, and I do a little bit of that going on. I also mess with the envelope release, so that means that this mid value here has the highest release, and then down here it goes away faster, and then it steadily decreases in speed or increases in release speed. Because longer release values means it takes longer to release, and smaller release values means it takes shorter time to release. And then modulator pitch shift is a fun window because, like we said earlier about how moving the pitch shift around moves the analysis up or down on the spectrum, we can actually change individual position of the spectrum's pitch position as a function of the spectrum. And that's what I've done here. Basically, the analysis that was here, I said, okay, move down this much, move down this much, move down this much, move down this much, and it basically changes the shape of the modulator's spectral location in the band's results. So that's a lot of fun. And this is basically, again, set the taste. All of this is really set the taste because the primary characteristics of your sound are going to be determined almost entirely by the characteristics of your carrier and your modulator. Primarily your carrier. The modulator, obviously, like the pitch and whatever will change, and like your vowels and stuff will be important, like that kind of sound. But the characteristic of the sound is going to more or less reside heavily on your choice in carrier. And messing around with that and like merging different things will yield very, very different results. Even if you have the same vocoder setting, different carriers and different modulators will yield extremely different results. I have a guitar break here not doing anything, so I'm gonna get rid of it. So that's kind of like the thing about vocoding. Now let's talk about what's going on in post. I have 2 different equalizers. I think it's because at one point I had something in between them. How necessary is this? I can kind of like... That's not my one. I probably had something else in that chain at one point. Anyway, I have this high pass going on here because I have the sub going on, but that's not super necessary because the way that the vocodex distribution is, you can actually see that it ends at like 80 hertz anyway. So that's why the sub reinforcement is necessary. Normally I do that inside vocodex where I actually turn on the carrier, and like this here, I have the mixer a max on the carrier, then you can, and then the carrier has a low pass filter. So I can actually say that I want the low end of the carrier to poke through, but I don't want to do that because I wanted the carrier's undistorted self to come through. So that's why I have the dry going to a sub and also to the carrier processing individually. Then I have a Maximus just to even out things. I utilize Maximus in its capacity to be a wave shaper, and what I've done is I turned down the release and head times and a little bit of attack going on in the high area, and I've what that basically means is that because the compression is being applied so fast that it's more or less a wave shaper at this point, especially because of how Maximus allows you to directly manipulate the in-out graph. I've covered this before in Maximus's tutorial on the FL Basics, so if you missed that, go to the FL Basics playlist and check that out for yourself. Also, if you aren't aware that I have those, you should look at them a lot because even if you were super duper pro at FL, chances are you have missed things. I mean, chances are I've missed things, I just didn't talk about them, so it could be an interesting watch. Again, this sort of stuff is set to taste. And then the sub happens, and the EQ to be the sub, and then it's all put together in a Maximus. Now, that high-frequency distortion thing I just talked about with the wave shaping is actually something, is a process that I gleaned from Far Too Loud's own bass processing. And he did that by basically doing the same thing with the sub, where he bust out an extra high-frequency layer and distorted that, and then kind of blended that in with the rest of the sound. But I did that pretty much in the set, in the mix of the high frequency coming out of the vocoder. And I'm not saying that's a better idea, because what he actually did, as I said, he blended it. He had this called vocoder channel on the dry, and he had that bust out, and then he distorted the high frequency, and then he EQ'd them both to fit the wet and the dry. I basically only have the wet at this point, and the way that I made the wet and dry work is that I messed with the attack on the high frequencies. Attack on high frequencies, because if it were 100% no attack time, it would be really, really distorty. But now, because it's just releasing the head time that are short, it's only kind of distorty. So that's sort of a similar result, but it's not precisely his style. And compressor to glue it all together. Now, again, I probably could have achieved some of this in Patcher. Like I could have done stuff like I would have had to have the carrier and the modulator. The carrier could have had, like, the carrier channel could have had all of this in one patcher in the effects insert, including the sub output, the processing, the vocoding, and then the modulator would have to be in a separate insert going into the carrier insert, and then that side input would go into the vocoder inside the patcher inside the carrier. That's something that could have happened, but I didn't do that. So, good job, me. Oh yeah, this is the carrier preview that I had. Gonna get rid of you. That's pretty much how I achieved this sound and what I approached in order to do it. If you listen to the actual track, Far Too Loud, 600 Years, which is a baller track, you'll definitely arrive at the conclusion that I didn't get exactly there, but this worked out pretty good. That was a weird sound. I look forward to the How to Bass on Friday when we talk about lots of the fun things I learned about FM when I was studying Far Too Loud's bass production techniques. So I look forward to that, as I just said, because that's what I said just now. And I hope you do too. So if you have any questions about any of this, let me know, and I will try to answer them. And as usual, have a nice day, I say as I end the video.